A very warm welcome to you to the latest Pyramid Guy video. Human history is full of objects that seem out of place in their own time, but few artifacts have sparked as much debate as the so-called Baghdad Battery. According to some, this is one of the earliest pieces of evidence that ancient people knew about and even used electricity. Others, however, consider the whole thing to be a simple misunderstanding. But is it truly an ancient battery, or is it just modern thinking trying to see technology where, in reality, it's about something else entirely? The story begins in the 1930s, when strange objects were unearthed in Iraq, near present-day Baghdad, in the area of Kuyut Rabu. The finds were examined more closely by Wilhelm König, a staff member at the National Museum of Iraq, and he was the one who first proposed the startling idea that these vessels might have functioned as electrical devices. The era they might date from is the Parthian or the later Sassanid period, which is roughly between 250 BC and 250 AD. This in itself is early enough for the idea of any kind of electrical technology to cause quite a surprise. Then the object's construction is simple at first glance, yet suspiciously familiar. It's a clay jar about 15 centimeters high, inside of which is a cylinder made of copper, and an iron rod fits into this. The whole thing is held together and sealed by bitumen, which is natural asphalt. This combination, that is, two different metals and a vessel that could potentially be filled with liquid, immediately brings to mind the image of a galvanic cell to the modern eye. Well, it's no wonder König's imagination took off, especially when he also saw finely gilded ancient objects in the museum, and of course it immediately occurred to him that perhaps the thin layer of precious metal was applied by electrical means. And the story starts to get really interesting here because although the idea seems logical at first, the details are much less clear-cut. The original archaeological context of the finds was not properly documented, which poses a serious problem. We don't know exactly in what environment they were found, along with what other objects, and this significantly complicates the interpretation as well. Moreover, it wasn't just a single such vessel that was found, as similar pieces were discovered in nearby areas, some containing, for example, decomposed plant fibers, or even papyrus remains, or other materials that are difficult to identify. These details point more towards some kind of storage or ritual function rather than towards clear technological use. And as for König's idea that these jars could have even functioned as galvanic cells, most archaeologists, well, naturally rejected it immediately. On one hand, there is no evidence that electroplating was used during that specific period, and on the other, the design of the finds doesn't fully support this theory in every detail. But according to some researchers, these vessels could have also served magical or ritual purposes, for example, for storing inscriptions, magic spells, or amulets. This doesn't even sound that surprising if we consider that many so-called magic bowls and other protective objects are known from the same era, which served as defense against demons or even curses. And well, in this context, the combination of metals and materials already carries a symbolic meaning rather than a technological one. The Baghdad Battery is therefore a kind of borderland between science and imagination, a simple-looking object in which modern man tends to see the precursor of his own technological world. But does it really preserve the trace of a lost knowledge, or is it just a tool from the past whose meaning we find difficult to understand today? The answer remains open for now, and perhaps that's exactly what gives the story its true magic. But if we set aside the mysticism and theories for a moment and look at the Baghdad Battery through the eyes of science, a surprising turn follows. Because however controversial the object's true purpose may be, modern experiments have shown one thing quite clearly, namely that under certain conditions, it really can produce electrical voltage. Well, not much, not stably, and not particularly efficiently, but the phenomenon does exist. The whole thing is based on an extremely simple physical principle. If we connect two different metals with a conductive liquid, a so-called electrolyte, then an electrical voltage is generated between them. This principle also powers today's batteries and accumulators, but in a much more sophisticated form. And when researchers and enthusiastic experimenters recreated this Baghdad Battery and filled it with, for example, vinegar or another mildly acidic liquid, the result was not lacking, and they were able to measure a voltage of about 1 volt. In the case of several reconstructions, this value could have been even higher, rising to around 1.5 volts. This might not seem like much at first, but consider that it's already enough to create detectable electrical phenomena. It doesn't light up a city and it doesn't power any serious device, but it exists. And it's this tiny fact that pulls the debate back to the starting point over and over again, because if it could work, then was it actually used? The scientific answer to this, however, is much more cautious than what we might expect at first. Most researchers emphasize that functionality in itself doesn't prove anything yet. Just because an object is capable of performing a certain function, it's not at all certain that it was originally designed for that. This is a fundamental but often overlooked difference. And this is where a critical perspective comes into play, because one of the biggest problems is that no supporting evidence has been found that would confirm electrical use. No wires were found that could have conducted the current, nor any system that would have connected several such vessels to increase the voltage. But what's perhaps even more telling is that there are no devices either that could have utilized this energy. A technology rarely exists on its own, it's usually part of an entire system, but here, there's no trace of that. An equally important argument is that among ancient artifacts we find no clear examples of metalwork performed by electrical means. The idea that these devices were used for gilding or electroplating, well, it sounds good, but archaeology hasn't provided any objects so far that would convincingly prove this. The existing gilded objects were actually made using other traditional techniques, so this idea seems more like a modern projection. But the Baghdad Battery could indeed have been capable of generating electrical voltage, but unfortunately, according to our current knowledge, nothing proves it was ever used that way. It's more of a strange object that can be interpreted in several ways, in which modern humans tend to see the precursors of their own technological world. And perhaps that's exactly what makes the story so exciting, because while it doesn't provide clear answers, it only raises more questions. But, you know, when the story of the Baghdad Battery truly steps outside the bounds of archaeology and enters a much broader, more exciting conceptual space, that's when we come in and start asking a lot of questions. Because while science carefully weighs and looks for evidence, alternative theories head in a completely different direction, often painting a much more grandiose picture of the past. For example, there's one of the best-known ideas that humanity already knew the basics of electricity 2000 years ago, but lost this knowledge over time. And in this interpretation, the Baghdad Battery isn't a strange coincidence, but a consciously created tool, which is a remnant of a more advanced technological era. Such lines of reasoning often start from the premise that ancient civilizations were much more sophisticated than traditional historical views suggest. The Baghdad Battery is thus not an exception, but a small piece of evidence for a much larger, a lost knowledge. From here, it's just a step to the paleo-astronautic interpretation, according to which the development of humanity was not a completely independent process. In this context, the Baghdad Battery could even be a technological fragment that a more advanced, say, non-terrestrial intelligence passed on to humans. And such theories often link this object with other mysterious ancient depictions and structures, such as the strange reliefs found in Dendera, Egypt, or even the supposed energetic functions of the pyramids. The story thus fits into a much larger narrative in which humanity did not invent, but rather inherited knowledge. But there is also that other popular trend according to which this phenomenon should not necessarily be explained by aliens, but by lost earthly civilizations. According to this, advanced cultures could have existed, often linked to myths similar to Atlantis, whose technological level far exceeded what we assume today about that given era. These civilizations, however, disappeared, and their knowledge survived only in fragments. The Baghdad Battery in this story is a kind of out-of-place artifact, a so-called U-part, which doesn't fit into the usual developmental arc, which is why it becomes so exciting. The real tension, however, does not lie in the object itself, but in how we interpret it. Because science strictly insists that claims be supported by evidence and that results be reproducible. Alternative approaches, on the other hand, tend to look for patterns and are more prone to drawing larger conclusions, even from incomplete data. These two perspectives, by the way, do not necessarily exclude each other, but they consider entirely different questions to be important. And perhaps here is the key to the whole story, because the most important question is not whether the Baghdad Battery was capable of producing electricity, but what it was actually used for. Functionality in itself is only a possibility, not proof. And I think the interpretation of the past also always depends on what evidence we accept and how we connect them with alternative thoughts. The Baghdad Battery is thus both very real and deeply mysterious at the same time. An object that really exists, yet constantly receives new meanings depending on who is looking at it. It could be a simple vessel, it could be a misunderstood tool, or even part of a lost technology, even technology coming from outer space. But however we interpret it, it's not the answer itself that makes it truly interesting, but precisely these questions that it raises. So, it would take a better man than me to tell you the absolute truth, but I'll venture to say that there is no such person. You, however, feel free to write down your opinion, your thoughts, as it could easily be that from collective thinking, the answer to this will one day be born. I'll be back next time with a similarly interesting thought. Until then, you guys take care. Kisses to you and rock and roll.